Welcome to Risk and Resilience podcast. I'm your host, Fox Ahmed. Most risk briefings are written for regulators. However, this one's written for you. Every week, I take the stories that matter in cyber and technology risk, covering the breaches and the regulations, the threats, and I break them down in digestible ways. No fillers, just version events that are publicly available in order to make you make better informed decisions. So I have a couple of stories today that I want to cover. And as a disclaimer, this is my opinion based on publicly available information. So the first story I really want to get into is they're already in and nobody's talking about it. So let me ask you something before we get into this particular news. If I told you that a particular government hackers, so nation state hackers, had already broken into some banks, not just probed the edges, not attempted to get in, but actually breached the network and was still inside when the story is published, would you expect this to be the biggest news story of the week? You'd think so, right? But it barely made any ripple effect across the media. So Symantec published a threat report back on Thursday, one of the most respected names in cybersecurity threat intelligence. And what it says should have been everywhere. Instead, it kind of got buried in terms of every other news that's going on. So there are some nation-state hackers that claim to be inside some banks and also infrastructure networks right now, actively as of this week. There was a group called Seedworm. And before anyone thinks this is some basement type of hacker operation, CISA, the US government's own cybersecurity agency, has formally described Seedworm as a subordinate element of Iranian Ministry of Intelligence Security. So this is a nation-state level kind of government directive hacking group, which was active since 2017. So they started in the Middle East and then expanded across into different sectors, covering telecoms, defense, energy, and government agencies across different regions from North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And back in February and also recently in March, they also went after something very specific. So Symantec researchers, what they say here is that Symantec researchers identified cyber activity linked to Iranian Advanced Persistent Threat Group, Seedworm, across the networks of several US organizations, with intrusions beginning in early February 2026 and continuing in recent days. The activity has affected a range of sectors, including some US American banks, an airport, non-governmental organizations, and also non-government organizations in the US and Canada as well. And they've also kind of gone into some of the supply and defense and aerospace industries from that side. If you read that list, you've got banks, you've got airports, NGOs across US and Canada, and also software companies that also supplies defense and aerospace industries. Now, here's the question I need you to sit with at the moment. If you are a bank, and every bank uses third-party software vendors, how confident are you that none of your vendors are on that list? Because supply chain attacks don't require you to be the primary target, they just require you to share a vendor with somebody who is. What did they leave behind on those networks? That's one thing you've got to answer. Is it a brand new backdoor nobody has ever seen before? And Symantec named it DINDOR. So found on software company itself, it was found in the software company, it was found in the US bank, it was also found on a Canadian NGO, which was custom built. It was digitally signed with a fraudulent certificate, so it slides right past the standard endpoint defenses. They also tried to exfiltrate data using a tool called rclone, pushing stolen files to a cloud storage bucket. Whether they got away with it is still unclear. The last sentence should really bother you as well. Still unclear weeks later. So, and then Symantec does something I really respect. They tell you exactly what comes next. This is the paragraph I'll be pointing out and putting on the table in my next kind of board meeting. Given the situation, given the current escalations between US and Iran, it is likely that CNI is a high risk of attack, as well as organizations supporting these entities. Organizations with exposed terminal operating systems, schedules, and trucking rail interfaces may be targeted, as well as passenger processing systems, baggage systems, and contractor networks. Additionally, given the high risk, other organizations that operate within sectors such as energy, fuel supply chains may also be targets. So, critical national infrastructure, contractor networks, supply chains. So, if your organization sits anywhere in that ecosystem or shares vendors and organizations that do, what is your current threat exposure? So, this is not really a threat forecast, but it's more actively and is a live campaign. And as any individual firms, whether you're in banking technology, are you kind of ready for this event? The next part of the news I do really want to cover is an update from the Royal United Service Institute. So here is something that doesn't get explained enough when people talk about some of the kind of cyber operations that's going on. So this is titled Fog, Proxies and Uncertainty, Cyber in the US, Israeli Operations in Iran. And the thing is, it's not just Iran doing it. I know it sounds strange, so let me explain. So Iran has spent years building what you can only describe a franchise model of cyber attacks. So they have their own government hackers. So we mentioned earlier there was Seedworm, and I think there's APT34 and APT42. But running alongside those, they cultivate a whole network of affiliated hacktivist groups. So groups that share the Iran strategic objectives, narratives, carrying out attacks that serve Iranian interests, but also operate independently outside of Iran, outside of any formal chain of command. So why does this matter? Because when something hits your network and your incident response team tries to work out who it is, they might not be able to. And I think that ambiguity is not just a flaw in Iran's model, but it is the model. So Dr. Lewis at the Royal United Services Institute, which is a London-based defence think tank, published a really sharp piece of analysis 2 days ago that lays this out kind of clearly. But one area that has struck out to me is that in terms of expanding the fog of crisis through the proxies, is that Iran has historically relied on a melange between state-sponsored and hacker groups for delivering cyber effects. So with network access limited to Iran since the start of the operations, proxies such as hackers based outside of the country can also take on patriotic activities that align with the military targets and perceived adversaries. But without consistent coordination with a state-based and government-linked groups, it remains unclear how impactful they might be. And here is the kicker. Right now, Iran itself is running at about 4% of its normal internet capacity because of the blackout imposed after the US strikes. So the state-sponsored hackers inside Iran are actually quieter than normal. The proxies outside of Iran are more active. So think about what that means for your threat intelligence. The tools for your SOC team uses to flag Iranian activity through known IP ranges, the recognized infrastructure signatures might not kind of trigger. The attack could look like unaffiliated hacktivism until someone does deep attribution work. By that point, weeks have passed. And who exactly are those proxy groups targeting right now? I think Dr. Harrell flags it in the report that there's electronic banking portals, e-commerce platforms are the targets, government services across the Gulf nations, including Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan. Banking is explicitly in the kind of crosshairs, not as collateral, but it's more deliberately kind of selected. And it's getting geographically wider. I think the Iranian retaliatory strikes have already hit some of the US military bases in Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait, and also across the UAE. And I think there is no longer a bilateral US-Iran story. It's become more of a regional escalation. And the cyber domain is tracking every step of that kind of expansion. So if you are a global bank with operations within the regions or with correspondent relationships, or even have some sort of infrastructure such as cloud routing through the Gulf states, you need to think about what does your risk exposure model look like today. So it's not it's not a question that we can answer now, but something that you can take away as homework. The next part I do want to talk about is that how will cyber warfare shape the US-Israel conflict with Iran? So I want to ask you something, and probably I want you to be honest with yourself, is when you hear the Iranians kind of cyber threat, do you mentally file it under future risk? Something to model for, which is a scenario to stress test, or a risk on a register that hasn't happened yet. Because for the banking sector specifically, this is not a future risk, it's a historical fact. So the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the most respected kind of policy research institutions that's out there, published their analysis on the 3rd of March. And they answer the kind of retaliation question the way I wish more analysts would kind of directly from their side. Is, if I can get to it, is will Iran retaliate, and how capable is Iran's offensive cyber program? Well, in here it says there is significant evidence that Iran will retaliate in cyberspace. The most recent escalation triggered what has been called the most aggressive use of Iran's state-directed Great Epic cyber campaign as part of the broader cyber Islamic resistance ideological framework. Iran's capacity to execute this campaign is well documented given its demonstrably sophisticated cyber capabilities. Wipeout attacks, DDoS attacks against major US banks, election interference campaigns, and also more recent exploitation of industrial control systems. So DDoS attacks against major US banks, let's be specific. This has been linked to some of the historical events that's probably happened back in 2012 or 2013, where there was loads of DDoS attacks which took down some online banking for some customers. I think that was, 10 to 13 years ago. So do you really think the capability has improved or degraded in the last 10 to 13 years since? So this study also puts in a number that I think is the most important single data point in this entire kind of episode itself. Following the strike, just last year, I think Radware reported that there was 700% increase in cyber attacks targeting the region following its military attacks in Iran since 2025. So that's 700% increase in cyber attacks targeting Israel following its military strikes in Iran in 2025. So with that, who are they attacking and retaliating and stuff? So I think with that, what they're saying is that they're kind of targeting financial services, water utilities, and transportation infrastructure, many of which rely on outdated control systems, remain attractive targets for Iranian actors as kinetic conflict intensifies. Financial services, top of the list, not buried in a footnote. And the note about outdated control systems, that isn't a general observation. That's a pointed comment about the legacy technology that is still running, not even on some of the kind of critical national infrastructures, but also on probably some other cross kind of sectors as well. And I think the regulators keep pushing for institutions to modernize their kind of technology stack and the roadmap. This could also, if it's the banking sector, there's payment systems, settlement systems, ATM networks, SWIFT connections. There's a whole correspondent banks that's in that region as well. And if your organization has kind of deferred to modernize your technology stack for whether it be for budget reasons or anything else, or for operational continuity, or the saying is we'll get to it next year, what does that decision look like now? Has that been now kind of escalated to take some action? And I think in this kind of summary here, I think definitely this report is worthy to read, and I think what they kind of suggest in here is because Iran's most domestic internet is essentially offline right now. The state-sponsored groups are kind of constrained and limited, but the proxies are not. And that's when you have two forces kind of combined together. So what they're saying is when you have state-aligned activity that blends in with globally distributed hacktivism, attacks can proliferate without clear coordination, complicating attribution and increasing the likelihood that cyber disruption will outpace the scope of military operations themselves. So I think cyber disruption that outpaces the scope of military operation itself, kind of, if you think about it, it means that the cyber fallout from this conflict could end up wider and more damaging than actual physical bombs and anything like that as well. And unlike bombs, which target kind of the military infrastructure, I think the cyber wave targets kind of everyone else. The other bit of the update I want to focus on as well before we move on to this theme is that the last piece in the Iranian bloc comes from this organization called Lawfare, which was published Friday, written by Tom Uren from a serious risky business newsletter, and he asked the question that changes whether any of what we've discussed actually really matters. Even if you know that the threat is coming, can your defenses actually keep pace with it? Because something has changed the mechanic of attacks, not just the techniques and the speed. So I think what Tom kind of aggregates data from the different reports from Cloudflare and IBM X-Force and Sophos and OpenAI. And if you look at some of the stats he comes out with, if I can pull it up, is that CrowdStrike reported that it took an average of just half an hour for intruders to move from their initial point of access to elsewhere in the victim's network. So this is down from 48 minutes last year and almost 100 minutes in 2021. 30 minutes. From the moment an attacker gets your initial access, it takes them 30 minutes before they are moving laterally through your network, reaching your kind of customer database or touching your core systems. And in 2021, you had 100 minutes to catch them. Right now, you had 30, and the trend is going down. And I think ReliQuest recorded data exfiltration beginning 6 minutes after the access. 6 minutes. So in 2024, that record was 4 hours. So you've got to think about what is your organization's mean time to detect right now. Is that kind of reducing? And if the honest answer is hours or days, then an attacker is through your network before your first alert kind of fires. And that's not hypothetical. I think if you're looking at stats that's being presented here. Now, and I say this because there's a lot of noise around AI and security, Tom cuts through it very well in the article. The attacks aren't really new, and the playbook hasn't really changed. What AI has done is to kind of turbocharge the execution speed. So if you read here, it says threat actors aren't doing anything novel. They are utilizing AI to implement the same techniques they always have, but they're doing it much faster, which means they can squeeze a lot more badness into their usual 9 to 5. This also means that from a defender's perspective, AI-related threats don't require any sort of magic bullet. Defenders need to lock down basic hygiene and do more of the same, but more quickly. And phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication has got to be part of the answer here. So again, Tom is saying there is no magic bullet here, just the fundamentals. Fundamentals need to be executed faster with no gaps. There needs to be phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. What I understand is, not to be SMS-based, which can get bypassed through SIM swapping, but I think there needs to be more hardware keys or app-based authentication out there. I think network segmentation, so lateral movement, is also kind of contained, so you need to think about that, and detection that fires in minutes as well. And there's one generally good news data point buried in this piece is that Chain Analysis published their 2025 ransomware payments analysis, and despite a 50% increase in claimed attacks, total payments barely moved. And the reason for that is probably there's a more improved incident response, which probably has more better international kind of law enforcement coordination on that side. So what I would say is that the investment around your resilience in your organizations are working, but only for the organizations that made them. And the question is whether you'll be, it's not whether you'll be targeted. I think in this current environment, that question has already been answered. I think the question is when something gets through, how fast did you find it and contain it and recover it? I think that is the main question that matters here as well. So my next part of the update, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, because I think, whilst Iran, is the urgent news story for this week, I think there's also some kind of structural risk story that has been kind of building quietly over the years, and the regulators are now kind of forcing it into the open as well. And maybe here's a question probably I want you to think about for a second. So what happens to a global financial system if Amazon Web Services goes down not just for 5 minutes, but for 6 hours? I think we've seen that happen back in December 2025 with some banks. You may have impact your payment system, the trading venues, clearing houses, mobile banking applications. A single portion of the world's financial infrastructure may, runs on a handful of cloud platforms, and now that's becoming a systemic risk. The numbers are striking. If I can get down here, numbers are striking. I think there's if you think about it, there are actually kind of free cloud service providers. There's AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud, which kind of control the dominant majority of the cloud, infrastructure globally. In Europe, especially US companies, kind of control 85% of the cloud market. Think about it, that's 85%. Now think about what that means for resilience. So if one of those free cloud providers experiences major outages or a global geopolitical disruption or a significant cyber attack, what cascades? So this is exactly what European regulators are wrestling with at the moment. And that's why the Digital Operational Resilience Act, known as DORA, is changing the conversation. I think the regulatory direction is being stated clearly in the legislation is that the European clearinghouses will need to diversify their kind of cloud providers. And the principle behind that is being articulated directly here, which, point in here is that on the article is that a single cloud is not sufficient. There should be fallbacks, either to clouds or on premises. I think that sentence captures the entire regulatory mindset perfectly. It's not about disrupting cloud technology. It's about recognizing that concentration risk itself is, it's a risk in itself. Central banks have been warning about this for a while. Your reliance on a small number of providers creates what they call a potential single point of failure for the financial system as a whole. And a single point of failure at infrastructure level doesn't behave like a normal operational outages. It behaves like more of a systemic event. So what is the industry response? So institutions are being pushed towards multi-cloud resilience strategies. Instead of running everything on one provider, you could design systems that could fail over across multiple cloud events or environments, or revert to on-premise infrastructure when needed. I think that's a simple idea, but it's genuinely difficult to kind of execute. Cloud environments are complex and are often deeply integrated with the banking architectures in ways that make switching, especially under pressure and time-sensitive events during an incident, technically very hard to execute without kind of prior planning and testing. And that's what's exactly the point the regulators are making. You cannot build the exit plan during a crisis. You have to build it now. And I think cloud concentration risk is not just a technology story, it's a systemic resilience story. And regulators are kind of treating it that way. And I've been working on DORA and the draft RTS and the draft legislation many, many years ago. So for banks and market infrastructures, what this means is that the cloud strategy decisions you're making today around which providers, which workloads, what fallback looks like are now a regulatory matter, not just an IT procurement matter in itself. My next update is a bit of a switch. I want to talk about obviously AI, and I know everyone's generally excited about AI and also generally kind of unsettled at the same time. And this McKinsey update from McKinsey is around agentic AI. So you heard of AI assistants, tools that respond to prompts and generate content and answer questions, and they're very helpful. But ultimately, you're still in charge. You're still the operator for those AI assistant tools. Agentic AI is different, and the difference is very important. And I think the way I kind of think about it is that an AI agent doesn't wait for a prompt. It is given an objective, and then it figures out how to execute it autonomously across the different systems, across the different workflows, without a human in the loop for every step. And McKinsey's recent analysis in their podcast really looks at how this is already beginning to reshape some of the banking operations with agentic AI. And the framing they use is worth paying attention to. And I think, where's it gone? Yeah, so in the report in here, I think they'll do say that agentic AI systems can autonomously execute complex workflows across banking operations. So autonomously execute complex workflows. Let that settle in for a moment. We're talking about AI systems that can monitor risk, can manage a compliance task, conduct investigations, execute operational processes, and coordinate across the different systems without waiting to be told what to do at each step. So if you think about what that could look like in practice, so if you take a process around fraud monitoring that doesn't flag a transaction and it waits for a human analyst, it kind of investigates, confirms, and it acts on that decision. Compliance investigations don't produce a report for someone to read. They identify the issue, then they trace it and initiate the remediation workflow. Again, regulatory reporting, also that doesn't require a team to compile itself. It runs itself with aggregating data from everywhere. So now here's the question nobody's kind of answering loudly enough yet. Is when the AI is the operator and the human is the supervisor, what happens when AI goes wrong? And historically, with banking operations, which were built around kind of human workflows supported by software, the human was the decision maker. The system was the tool. With agentic AI, that architecture kind of flips. The system becomes the operator and the human becomes the supervisor. And that is a fundamentally different risk profile. Because if a human makes a bad decision in a compliance workflow, you can trace it, you can audit it, and you can also retrain the person in terms of what went wrong and how to make sure it's not repeated again. But if an AI agent makes this kind of a series of decisions across a complex operational workflow and then something goes wrong, how did you identify and audit that? How do you detect it when an AI is being manipulated or when it's drifting from its intended kind of parameters? These are not hypothetical questions. I think these are questions that the future of banking operating models depends on answering with your colleagues, risk, compliance, operations. But me, from a resilience perspective, I think the adoption of agentic AI is not a reason for alarm, but I think it's a reason for deliberate governance. Every institution that deploys these systems needs to be asking, how do you maintain human oversight, your governance? How do you push it through your standard software development lifecycle, your committees for approval? How do you build it in audit trails? How do you test for failure modes before they become incidents? Because I think the efficiency gains, you could gain a lot of efficiency, but also the risk service is also real. The institutions that manage both are clearly the ones that probably win this kind of race in terms of the transition to adopt agentic AI. So it's worth reading, going on to the McKinsey podcast report itself. I want to shift into the next part. I think there's been some updates here. Maybe I'll cover this next time. So the next one, I think, it's not being covered as much as I've seen, is there's a story that's been out. A government hacking tool just escaped the lab, which appears to me, and is targeting your smartphones. And I'm going to finish up my podcast today just with this story, which sounds more like a thriller novel to me. I think, except that it's real and it's been documented, and it has direct implications for many people in different sectors across technology and financial sectors as well. So what's happened, based on my reading of this and other research, is that a hacking toolkit, which is capable of breaking iPhones, um, which suspectedly is kind of originating from a government-grade surveillance operation, has leaked into criminal ecosystem. And researchers from even Google's threat intelligence group have found evidence that tens of thousands of devices may have already been infected. And I think the tool is called Coruna. I think Coruna. And before anyone thinks, hey, it's I use Android, so it's not really my problem. It's probably iPhone. I think what the researchers have already identified is that it's kind of could be used across that platform. And also, you've got to remember that your modern iPhone or your smartphone security is built on different layers. And to kind of break to you don't exploit one vulnerability. You kind of need to exploit several in kind of sequence. And I think this is what researchers call exploit chain. And breaking through one layer gets you into the next layer of defense, and then blah, 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 and so forth. And then you kind of break that, and then you go to the next as well. So I think in here, researchers kind of from Google's threat intelligence group found that the Corona contains 23 different vulnerabilities to exploit iPhones and break into devices. That's 23 different vulnerabilities. And package that into a reusable toolkit, then you got yourself something that you can deploy easily. And I don't think this is not someone who found a vulnerability just by chance and built a tool around it. And I think this is more of an industrial grade capability to kind of identify the exploit change and 23 vulnerabilities for that. But I think the question is, how does this attack actually work? So based on the research that has been concluded, that it typically, the attacker compromises a legitimate website that their targets are most likely to visit. So it could be news sites, it could be crypto exchanges, anything you visit, shopping or whatever. So when a vulnerable iPhone user visits the site with nothing more than a page load, a malicious code then embedded in the page launches the exploit. So the attack begins at the Apple's WebKit browser engine, which powers Safari, and then it executes it in stages. So I think in stage one, it kind of break out of the browser environment. Then stage two, it kind of escalates, into the privileged kind of escalates the privileges to gain system level access. Stage three, it then kind of installs the kind of payload in itself. And at that point, the attacker's in, and the user has no idea. And the question is, what can they do once they are inside and the payload has been executed? Is that some of the Corona deployments were specifically designed to hunt for financial data. The malware scans files for keywords such as backup phrase, bank account, wallet seed phrases, and then can extract those kind of text messages or photos, app data, or your kind of login credentials, or any kind of communication records you may have on your phone, and kind of share that. But here's the part that matters most for more financial institutions specifically as well, is that the mobile phones often store authentication tokens and also session credentials for the banking applications. So when you have a compromised phone, it just doesn't expose your personal data. It also becomes a gateway into your corporate systems. So it could be email, cloud platforms, or enterprise applications as well. So all it takes is one infected phone, one employee's device, and then that could be a potentially backdoor into your organization. Now, I think the other question is, how did this toolkit end up in criminal hands? Researchers traced it to its evolution across several actors. It first appeared in a surveillance operation run by a customer of a commercial spyware vendor. Then it kind of surfaced in a campaign linked to Russian espionage targeting Ukrainian websites. And then it appeared in financial crime campaigns run by Chinese cyber criminals using fake crypto and gambling sites to infect victims. So when you see the pattern evolving in terms of use case, you can clearly tell it's government grade capability. Somehow it got leaked out, then it got spread into the criminal ecosystem, and now it's getting repurposed by different state actors with completely different kind of goals as well. And for banks and financial institutions, I think the implications are concrete. Mobile devices are now kind of also your core financial infrastructure. So you've got to ensure there's multi-factor authentication place, across your kind of trading platform access, your mobile banking apps, your crypto apps as well. So also what you can do as a user is also keep your devices patched. I think this exploit here, this exploit kit only targets ISO 13 through to 17.2.1. So organizations running current iOS versions have reduced exposure. But older devices and corporate networks are a real risk. So what I will do is audit which employees have access to sensitive systems from their personal devices, and also treat mobile endpoint security with the same seriousness as laptop and server security as well from that side. So that concludes all my updates today. So I'll catch you in the next episode. And my name is Fox Ahmed, and speak to you soon.